very much for joining us today here virtually with the National Library of Ireland. We're very pleased to welcome Lizzie Dunford this evening, who is the director of Jane Austen House, who's going to talk to us about Jane Austen and Ireland. Lizzie joined us here in Dublin in November for an in-person lecture at the library, so we're very excited to have her return this evening for this online lecture. So I hope everyone enjoys, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to Lizzie now.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute joy to be at the National Library back in November. I loved the site, I loved the building, and it was just wonderful to be back in Dublin after too long an absence. So I'm really looking forward to now being in this digital space and talking more about Austen and Ireland. I'm the director of Jane Austen's House today, and Ireland has been with me one way or another since the start of my career. I've been at Jane Austen's House for the past 5 years, but I started my career working for the National Trust at Shaw's Corner, which was the home of Nobel Prize and Oscar-winning Irish playwright George Bernard Shaw. I have worked in other museums and cultural sites over the years, but none have captured my affection and interest quite as much as Shaw's or Jane Austen's house. Both of these houses are beautiful, with fascinating collections and glorious surroundings. But the hold they have over me is the personalities that once lived and the personalities that were created within them. So whilst this evening will mostly be focused on Jane Austen and her collection with Ireland, I will open with a short diversion into Jane Austen's house as a literary site of pilgrimage and what we can learn about it from Austen's ongoing relevance and legacy and how that's shaped when it's contrasted with Shaw's Corner. I will, of course, predominantly be talking about the presence of Ireland within Austen's life as a political entity, as geography, and inspiration, and how we discover it on the page. And here I must add in a very big caveat. In case my accent hasn't already given it away, I am English, and I've spent all my life living and working in England and am descended from generations of Somerset peasants. Now, I am married to a man with an Irish passport and spent many years working in the home of two proudly Irish people in Shaw and his wife Charlotte, but I will remain almost certainly the most ignorant person in this digital room when it comes to Irish history. Now, I strongly believe that Irish history and an unbiased Irish history should be taught and read and disseminated and understood more widely in England and beyond. But I am still learning myself and do not stand or sit, as it is, here in any way, pretending to be an expert, particularly in these areas that I will touch upon. I also acknowledge that many of the sources through which I have engaged with this Irish history have been written through a British lens. I am going to try and undo some of that in some of the things I'll talk about tonight, but I therefore and completely apologise in advance for any mistakes or lack of depth in these areas, and look forward to learning so much from all of you for the chat. So, working in writers' houses. My time spent at Shaw's Corner and Jane Austen's house means that I have been incredibly lucky to work in what I am going to call, however inaccurately, the two birthplaces of the great Elizas of literature. That is Eliza Doolittle and Eliza Bennet. These houses also have similarities. They were both the final homes of their respective authors and the place from which their most famous works came from. In Shaw's case, this house was the place from which Pygmalion with Eliza Doolittle was written in 1912, whilst Jane Austen's house is the place from which all of Austen's full-length novels were written or came into their final form. Their lives, however, were very different durations, and this has shaped their houses, their legacies, and how they came to be. Shaw was born in 1856 and died in 1950 in the drawing room of Shaw's Corner, just behind where those daffodils are, that window there. And he was 94 when he died. He was born into the age of the horse and carriage, but by the time of his death, he had flown across the Atlantic, owned motorcycles and motor cars, and appeared regularly on radio, film, and even television, as well as having movies made of his work. His longevity also allowed him to leave 52 plays, including not just Pygmalion, but Mrs. Warren's Profession, Man and Superman, John Bull's Other Island, and St. Joan, for which he was awarded the Nobel Prize. He wrote thousands of essays and articles, and even more letters filled with millions of words. He lived during the dawn of today's world of international celebrity, and he courted it. Two things that would have been both unimaginable and unthinkable for Austen. Austen, in contrast, passed away at just 41, only 6 years after the publication of her first novel. Of her words, all that survives are 161 letters, 6 novels, and a small handful of fragments and short stories. She moved to Chawton Cottage, here on the right, now Jane Austen's house, in July 1809, and left it in May 1817, when she was very poorly, to be closer to her doctors in Winchester, and she never came home. In those intervening years between 1809 and 1817, from this house, she revised and wrote Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, Northanger Abbey, and Persuasion, and started Sanditon. This is a period of unparalleled creativity, which has left an unrivaled and global legacy. And it's interesting to think if she had lived to 94 like Shaw did, what else we might have seen from her. When it came to the opening of the houses, there's some 133 years between the deaths of Shaw and Austen, but their homes opened just 1 or 2 years between each other. Jane Austen's house opened on the 24th of July, 1949, and this is an image from the opening with the Duke of Wellington and Theodore Carpenter, who bought the house. And we have now been open for 75 years from last year, from July 49. Whereas Shaw's Corner began its life as a National Trust property in March 51. You can see there are huge crowds for both of them. You have here various descendants of Austen's brothers alongside the Duke of Wellington, whereas when Shaw's opened, a special train was laid on from London out to the nearest station, and actresses regaled the audience with their memories. Now here we see a closeness in the opening of the two homes, but a disparity of the distance between their deaths. We see a change in the transitioning between private residences to public spaces. And this gives us a really chance to unlock a deeper understanding of the fame of authors, their literary legacy, and the links between that and national identity. This is more important and more interesting than ever in 2025, particularly for us at Jane Austen's house. This year marks 250 years since Austen was born, on a very, very cold December day in the Hampshire village of Steventon. She was born on the 16th of December, 1775. And this year is full of celebrations and commemorations of her extraordinary life, of which, pleased to say, this evening is one. We're currently a little under 3 months into this anniversary year. After a whole period of anniversaries, we started celebrating anniversaries in 2009, we had her death in 2017, all the publication of the novels. And after all of that, it is still clear that Austen's star shows no sign of dimming. Far from it, she remains as much an inspiration and an influence as ever. Her readership is wider than ever, and people engage with her work and characters in more formats and more ways than ever before. At the heart of this world and this celebration and commemoration is Jane Austen's house, the workplace of our authoress's imagination. And I love the phrase "our authoress," by the way. This is what her brother Henry called her in the biographical note that he wrote as a preface to the posthumous publication of Persuasion and Northanger Abbey. And I think it's just lovely. It shows from Henry and from the family just such a pride in her achievements. And it's a family perception of her work that is often overlooked. And there is a reason why this is, the general tendency of Austen's first family biographers, who were her brother Henry, and then later her nephew James Edward Austen Nee, is to celebrate her goodness, her sweetness, her even temper. She was such a sweet woman, beautiful great Aunt Jane. Her writing is something that is presented as almost secondary to her ideal feminine qualities. So it is rather wonderful to see our authoress tucked away among the platitudes and the verbal airbrushing of a woman whose letters reveal her to be far more complicated than her male relatives would allow, if indeed they even realise this fact themselves. But I digress. One of the many reasons that writers' houses are so fascinating is that they give us an opportunity to discover more about the inner workings of the mind of the author. Or at least that is the theory. This here is Shaw's desk and Shaw's corner, and it's left as he had it, with full of objects. But there is an element of reality where it's almost impossible to capture someone's thoughts and feelings through the relics they left behind. I would go further and say that if we don't feel that we can truly know an author when we have read the products of that mind and imagination, when we have read their published works and fragments and letters, and still have a sense that they are knowable, what difference will it make walking through the rooms of their homes? But logically, it does. To visit a writer's house is to embody their physical space. The very tangibility of the visit, the breathing of the same air, the creaking of the same floorboards under your feet, all communicates a commonality of experience with the beloved author, a familiarity that is once inspiring and reassuring. The contents of the houses also tell us, again in theory, much about the interests and private passions of the writer. What colours did they like to have around them? What did they like to look out on from the space in which they wrote? And it also leads to the question to us. If we look out on a view like that, what could we write? And we go away from these houses dreaming of characters and plots, or perhaps, certainly in my case, just a quiet, peaceful space in which to think and write. And perhaps if we have all of that in place, we can, like both Austen and Shaw, create novels and plays that change the world. One of the reasons why I've shown this desk is because it shows the disparity between what we have, the relics and the belongings that are left by Shaw and by Jane Austen, and what we have at Jane Austen's house. This is a collection of items relating to Jane Austen that come from the very earliest days of the museum. And the house opened 132 days after the day on which 132 years after the day on which she was buried. Shaw's Corner is full of stuff, books, Nobel Prizes, Oscars, paintings, thousands of objects. But we didn't have this at Jane Austen's house when it opened. There was no, what we would call an indigenous collection, which means objects that were still in situ from its original owners at the point when the house became a museum. Even the phrase original owners is a far more complicated concept for us here at Jane Austen's house. At Shaw's, he moved into his home in 1906, just 2 years after the house was built. His life makes up almost all of its story. Jane Austen's house, where I am sitting tonight, was already over 200 years old when she moved in, and had had a rich and varied life, starting out as a timber-framed thatched farmhouse into a really quite substantial building with 5 acres of land, which in the 18th century had spent time as an inn, and then a steward's house for the village of Chawton. Following her death in 1817, Jane's sister Cassandra, her mother, and her sister-in-law all continued to live at the house. Mrs. Austen died in 1827. Martha left to be married in 1828, leaving Cassandra to live on in the house until her own death in 1845. Now, another fascinating thing about these two houses that I've been privileged to work in is that neither of the people that lived in neither of these writers had children, biological children, living children. But Austen explicitly described her books as her children. She powerfully and I think incredibly memorably and emotively called Pride and Prejudice her darling child. And when she was working on the second edition of Sense and Sensibility, she told her sister that she could no more forget its progress towards publication than a mother could forget her suckling child. That means that the progeny of both these houses is not babies or toddling infants, but the novels and plays, and perhaps even more so the characters that have come out of these houses. Eliza Doolittle, Henry Higgins, Elizabeth Bennet, and Fitzwilliam Darcy. These are the children of these houses. We also have an interesting thing here about the lack of direct descendants. it means that the task of preserving and amplifying these authors doesn't pass through a direct line. For Austen, the mantle of sharing and displaying her legacy was passed first to her siblings and then on to their children. Neither Austen's brothers nor her mother were a great respecter of the physical remnants that channeled Austen memory, whatever they might have put in print. The famous 12-sided writing table on which we believe that Austen wrote and revised her novels was given away by her mother after her death to a manservant who was getting married and setting up his own household. And it was his family and descendants who preserved the precious, fragile piece of furniture. Austen came from a large family, and a family that grew even larger with the next generation. She was the 7th of 8 children and the youngest of only 2 daughters. These family connections and codependence fundamentally shaped both Austen's life and her afterlife. After Jane's sister's death, Cassandra's death in 1845, their wealthy elder brother, Edward, had the Chawton cottage rather brutally divided into 3 separate tenements to house estate workers. Doors were moved and the internal layout, predominantly on the first floor, was changed in ways that we still don't quite understand. What followed was a century of comparative neglect, and you can see in this fabulous picture here, which is some point after 1917, the chimneys are actually being held on with wires. And when the house opened in 1949, very little remained of the home that Austen knew. And this means that when the time came for the house to make its transition from a private house to a public institution, by necessity, the process had to be one of reconstruction, of careful storytelling, and on occasion, outright but considered fabrication. This image is of the dining room here at Jane Austen's house today, and it's a great example of this. You can see her little writing table tucked away in the corner in front of the clock, and the table is set for breakfast, whilst the walls are papered with a brilliant, vibrant green wallpaper. And this is a room that has been designed by our modern curators and by our team to capture a moment in time and to tell a story. The table has been at the museum from the very beginning, but the wallpaper was only put up in 2019 after it was rediscovered, and the table was dressed for breakfast in 2020. This was the room in which Austen wrote, in which she revised and created her characters and plot lines. We know that she wrote furiously, crossing out and rewriting as she went, sometimes pinning in patches of paper over bits that she didn't like and wanted to change. We have to imagine her bent over this table, hard at work, writing the words that would conjure Emma Woodhouse and Eliot and Mary Crawford into life. This is a workshop, a workplace, but it is also a domestic space at the heart of the family home. We know that in the all-female household in which Austen lived, jobs were divvied up, everyone taking on roles that suited their interests, skills, and priorities. I think Jane got the best jobs. Her task was to make breakfast. And so here we see tea and toast laid out in the morning and everything you need to have a feast. The other of her jobs was to order the wine and the tea, which sounds rather fabulous domestic task. If all I had to do at home was order wine and tea, I'd be very happy. And it all took place surrounded by the ancestor, the original of this original astonishing wallpaper. So whilst this room is a recreation, it is also truly authentic, and not just to its own past, but to what we know of Austen's interior and creative life. It's through this recreation, this accumulation of objects and stories over the past 75 years, that we were able to get the first glimpses of Ireland at Jane Austen's house. And we are going to start with probably the most famous. This young man is called Tom Lefroy, and with his pomaded hair and his slightly nervous smile, he looks like he might have just stepped out of an Austen novel. Indeed, quite a few people believe that he might have stepped into one. This miniature was painted in about 1798, most likely for the women to whom he'd been married the following year. But 2 years before, he had spent his Christmas holidays staying with his aunt and uncle in Hampshire and had danced at a couple of balls with the impetuous young daughter of the vicar of the neighbouring parish. The holidays came to an end and he returned to his legal studies. The young woman, of course, was Jane Austen, and the 2 short letters to her sister Cassandra, in which their brief relationship was documented, have over the following 2 centuries established their brief contact as potentially the love of Austen's life. This is what Austen writes to Cassandra, her sister, on Saturday, the 9th of January, 1796, which is also the date of Cassandra's birthday and a day after Tom Lefroy's 20th birthday. She writes, I am almost afraid to tell you how my Irish friend and I behaved. Imagine to yourself everything most profligate and shocking in the way of dancing and sitting down together. I can expose myself, however, only once more, because he leaves the country soon after next Friday. He is a very gentlemanlike, good-looking, pleasant young man, I assure you. But as to our having ever met except at 3 balls, I cannot say very much. For he is so excessively last about me at Ashe that he is ashamed of coming to Steventon, and ran away when we called on Mrs. Lefroy a few days ago. Tom seems to have got over his embarrassment a little, because Austen closes the letter by telling Cassandra that since she had written the above, she had received a visit from Mr. Tom Lefroy and his cousin George. If he, and that is Tom Lefroy, has but one fault, which time I will trust entirely remove, it is that his morning coat is a great deal too light. He is a great admirer of Tom Jones, and therefore wears the same coloured clothes, I imagine, which he did when he was wounded. 6 days later, with the promised final dance approaching, Austen wrote to Cassandra again. Friday. At length the day is come on which I am to flirt my last with Tom Lefroy, and when you receive this it will all be over. My tears flow as I write at the melancholy idea. Now, the backdrop to this is the very letter that she writes. It's now part of the collection at Jane Austen's house, and we own it jointly with the Bodleian Library. This is the earliest letter of Austen's in physical existence, meaning that it is rather unprosaically known as Letter 2. Whilst we know the content of the letter she wrote on the 9th of January, Letter 1, the physical object itself for Letter 1 hasn't been seen since 1893. So these 2 letters are therefore the very first examples of Austen's correspondence that we see. They are a window into her young world, as well as being an introduction to Austen's sarcasm and satire. I've been privileged to hold this letter and see it many times, particularly when it's been displayed. And I can assure you, despite what Austen says, this letter is distinctly un-tear-stained. Time now for a short digression. You've already seen one, and there will be several during this talk. This digression is to ask, how much do we really know about Austen? And what are the sources for what we do know? Austen is so firmly established within popular consciousness and has become such an iconic figure that it is sometimes easy to overlook quite how little we actually know about her and how sparse the sources for her life, and most particularly her emotions and experiences really are. Let's look at what these sources are. We have her creative writings, her darling children, the 6 completed novels, Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. None of her handwritten manuscripts of these survive, apart from a cancelled chapter of Persuasion, which was kept and survives down to the present day. We then have the unpublished and unfinished works, the 3 volumes of her teenage writings, Lady Susan, and the unfinished fragments of The Watsons and Sanditon. Those are her works, her creative works. When I said that the teenage writings have now been published, none of these were published during her lifetime. These are fascinating, inspiring words that have shaped this incredible legacy. They are products of her imagination, and much as there is a considerable desire to the contrary, it is difficult to link events in her novels with distinct events in her life. There are a handful of exceptions, but they are just that, a handful. The novels are extraordinary testaments of her imagination, an insight into how she viewed the world, and possibly how she thought things could be. Possibly. Are they a manifesto? Do they lay out a schema for morality? Are they works of art? Do they critique or do they praise her society? Over the 200 years since their publication, every possible interpretation of Austen's political, religious, and social views has been taken from her novels. Some see her as a devout Anglican and her novels as didactic moral keystones, whilst others see her questioning the church, the establishment, and having even some decidedly nonconformist leanings. Some see her novels as fundamentally upholding the status quo, whilst others read in them a profoundly anti-patriarchal rallying cry. And Austen herself, is she someone who changed the course of literature forever, or someone who is following in the footsteps of giants? Do we have someone who is a collaborator or a revolutionary? Full disclosure, for me, she is a revolutionary, and it is this aspect of her work that continues to inspire me. What makes this vast spectrum of opinions possible? And they're all valid, their own evidence, but it is the paucity of evidence, either in her own words or of those who knew her, about her own opinions. Of her non-creative writings, we only know the content of those 161 letters. And it is difficult to tell if all this content is accurate. There's quite a few of them, like Letter 1, that have never been seen by anyone outside the Austen family and have themselves been missing since the 1890s. In Austen's will, she left the majority of her possessions to her elder sister Cassandra. This included the manuscripts and the letters. We don't know how many there would have been, but it is likely that she wrote thousands in her lifetime. Before her death in 1845, Cassandra worked through this archive and selected which to keep and which to destroy. Now, this is a time to challenge a myth and a question and what is almost a slur against Cassandra. So often we have this discussion of, oh, why did Cassandra burn the letters? What was she trying to hide? And I think we have to slightly change our perspective in this and look at it from the completely opposite direction. At this time period, it was very normal to burn people's letters after they died. The vast archives and resources that we can now see are the exception rather than the rule. We should not look at this as the burning of the letters. Instead, we should look at this as the saving of Austen's words. Now, what doesn't survive is the letters to Austen. Not from her brothers, not from her friends, not from Cassandra's herself. Austen's surviving letters represent only one side of a lifelong conversation. In the archive that Austen left, of that, Cassandra ruthlessly eradicated every voice but Jane's. When Austen died, if she hadn't destroyed them herself, and we don't know, she would have had hundreds of letters from Cassandra. Answers to her own missives. There would have been updates from her brothers when they were spread out across the country and across the world. If we can see this, and if we do continue to call this what it would have been Austen's archive, we can see that Cassandra edited this archive to the point that all that remained, with only a handful of exceptions, is Austen's own words. Far from destroying or editing or controlling too much her sister's legacy, Cassandra's actions made sure that Jane's voice spoke out alone, uninterrupted and unchallenged by her friends and relations. I am presenting this here as a good thing, and in some ways it is. But it is also a great tragedy to have lost Cassandra's voice, her friend Martha Loy's voice. We now have, instead of a dialogue, instead of that murmur of conversation, a lone voice talking out from us from the past. How much richer would our understanding of Austen's life, her cycle, her circle, her thoughts and experiences have been if Cassandra had kept her own letters that she sent to Jane? But she didn't. And instead, we have these 161 letters written between 1796 and 1817. Naturally, their contents have shaped and dominated what we know of Austen's life and have led to the prioritization and centralization of some facts over others. This includes the very brief romance with Lefroy. So these first two surviving letters were sent in January 1796. Later that year, Austen began work on the first draft of what would become Pride and Prejudice, then called First Impressions. It has been suggested that Tom Lefroy, just remember the young man who ran away when Austen came to visit, was a model for Mr. Darcy. Or perhaps she had Lefroy in mind when she had the character of Lady Dalrymple in Persuasion think that the hero of the novel, Captain Wentworth, was Irish. "A very fine man indeed," said Lady Dalrymple. "More air than one often sees in Bath. Irish, I say. For me, this means that I start to think of Wentworth as looking rather like Colin Farrell, which is also, I believe, a sadly missed casting opportunity. Many things with this have been suggested, in fact. There's been books, there's been films on the subject, the majority of which do tell us that this diffident young man, Tom Lefroy, grew up to work his way up through the ranks of the Irish judiciary to be appointed Lord Chief Justice of Ireland in 1852. What is less frequently mentioned is that he'd been a member of Parliament throughout many years before. If, and it was always a very big, hugely unlikely if, Jane Austen had married Tom Lefroy, and if she had lived, she would have married a man who opposed reform in Ireland for over 6 decades and who was a privy councillor in Ireland throughout the years of the Great Hunger. The young man, who apparently, according to Jane, was a great admirer of the decidedly naughty Tom Jones, hero of the first official English novel written by Henry Fielding in 1749, grew up to be a devout and didactic evangelical Protestant whose letters read considerably more like those of Mr. Collins than of Mr. Darcy. What might have appealed to the young Lefroy in Fielding's novel was its setting against the backdrop and failure of the Jacobite Rising. Because Lefroy wasn't just an ardent Protestant, he actively campaigned against reform, and especially against any tolerance of Catholicism. An editorial in the Times of London in 1829 described Lefroy and his colleague as re-edifying the Orange disciples in Dublin, and he maintained his conservative, deeply religious beliefs until his death. This is not a natural partner for someone who so fiercely defended the rights of Mary, Queen of Scots, and Charles I. We don't see Ireland in Austen's letters again until the November of 1813, towards the end of the year in which Pride and Prejudice was published. The novel was a great success and was widely read and commented upon. Rightly proud of her novel, Austen collated the responses to it and made sure that she shared them with her sister. On 3rd November 1813, she wrote to tell Cassandra that, "I am read and admired in Ireland too. There is a Mrs. Fletcher, the wife of a judge, and an old lady and very good and clever, who is all curiosity to know about me. What am I like and so forth? I am not known to her by name, however." The judge in this case was William Fletcher, who, like Tom Lefroy, was educated at Trinity College, and who again, like Lefroy, was a member of Parliament and was a justice in the Court of Common Pleas. In fact, when Fletcher died, Lefroy took his place in the court. Now, this link has suggested that Mrs. Fletcher must have been introduced to Austen's work through Tom Lefroy, a rather charming suggestion of lingering affection and desire to promote his lost love's work. Now, this is not just to ignore a 25-year age gap between Fletcher and Lefroy, but also a difference in politics. Just a few months after Austen recounted Mrs. Fletcher's reading of P&P, Judge Fletcher gave what has been described as a fiery speech to the County Wexford Summer Assizes, in which he went beyond criticism of just the absentee landlords and tithes, but also, in the phrases, violently attacked, in words, the Orange Order. He is quoted as saying that Orange societies have produced the most mischievous effects. They poison the very fountains of justice, and even magistrates under their influence have in too many instances violated their duty and their oaths. Given what we have seen earlier, it is possible that the magistrates he was referring to might in fact include Tom Lefroy. It is difficult to see these two men being friends. Mrs. Fletcher's son, another William, married the youngest daughter of one of the founding members of the United Irishmen, Archibald Hamilton Rowan. Time for another digression here, although this one will be shorter than the last. As well as bewailing Cassandra's burning of Austen's letters, another common confusion about Austen's life is her anonymity and her contemporary fame. All of Austen's novels were published anonymously. She never saw her name on the title pages of her works, and indeed, despite her ambition and her avowal of herself as an authoress, she also seems to have been determined to protect her anonymity. But this does not mean that her novels were not successful. On the contrary, Pride and Prejudice was the novel of the season in 1813 and went into 3 editions within Austen's lifetime, while Sense and Sensibility was into its 2nd edition before Pride and Prejudice was published. We must also ask ourselves, If these books were completely known, under the radar, obscure in the 1810s, then why on earth would the Prince Regent, the most powerful and important, if not necessarily the most effective person in the country, wanted to be associated with them? In just 3 novels, Austen had established what we would now, and I apologize to everyone that's going to do this, but I can't think of a better way to describe it, her brand. She had a sense of value. She'd created something that was distinct, and it was something that the Prince Regent wanted to be aligned with. Why would he want to be aligned with this, something that was completely unknown? Austen's name might have been unknown, but her works were not, and that is an important distinction. Austen had many famous readers in her lifetime, but there were some that mattered more to her than others. And one of those readers was the Anglo-Irish writer Mariah Edgeworth. Writing in 1814, when she was advising her niece Anna, who had just started to write her own novels, Austen said, "I have made up my mind to like no novels really, but Miss Edgeworth's, yours, and my own." And this is Mariah Edgeworth. She was born in Oxfordshire in 1768, which made her 7 years older than Austen. And she moved to Ireland when her father remarried in 1773. She was just 5 years old at the time, and they came to live at her father's estate in Modstrom, which they also called, very arrogantly, Edgeworthstown. She was the eldest of her father's 22 children. He married 4 times, once to 2 sisters, and we shall see that again later on. And after a childhood being educated in England, she spent the rest of her life living, working, and writing at Modstrom, Edgeworthstown. Now, unlike Austen, she did travel widely. She spent time in France during the brief Peace of Amiens in 1802, and she did choose to spend and meet time with other literary celebrities of her day. In 1813, she met Lord Byron in London and had a long correspondence with Walter Scott, even visiting him at his home in Abbotsford. So she was a form of literary pilgrim in her own way. And unlike Austen, she did not publish anonymously. Her name was on her novels. And also, unlike Austen, her father was at first not particularly supportive of her novels. He was supportive of her writing and preferred that she could focus on sort of intellectual works that help with sharing his theories and thoughts of education. She did publish her novels. First one was anonymously, and then she published it on her name. And she published nearly 30 books in her lifetime, of which many were novels. One of her earliest was called Belinda, which is included in Austen's famous defense of the novel in Northanger Abbey. And this is, she's had someone say, "And what are you reading, miss?" "Oh, it is only a novel," replies the young lady, while she lays down her book with effective indifference or momentary shame. "It is only Cecilia or Camilla or Belinda, or in short, only some work in which the greatest powers of the mind are displayed, in which the most thorough knowledge of human nature, the happiest delineation of its varieties, the liveliest effusions of wit and humour are conveyed to the world in the best chosen language." So Austen really loved Edgeworth. The other 2 novels, Cecilia and Camilla that I mentioned, are written by Fanny Burney, and Fanny Burney is just the most fabulous writer as well. I strongly recommend, in particular, her novel In Letters and Evelina, which is very funny and just fabulous. And Evelina gets herself in all sorts of trouble, and it's wonderful. We know that this was a 2-way dialogue. It wasn't just Austen reading Edgeworth. Edgeworth was reading Austen. They were both publishing novels through the 1810s, and Edgeworth recorded her responses to Mansfield Park, Northanger Abbey, and Persuasion. Of Mansfield Park, she wrote that she had been very much entertained. I love Mansfield Park. It's possibly one of my favourite of Austen's novels. I wouldn't necessarily describe it as entertaining, thought-provoking, moving, powerful, occasionally funny, brilliant, entertaining. I don't know. But she also wrote a rather longer commentary on the double publication of Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. This is what Edgeworth wrote to her aunt. "I entirely agree with you, my dearest aunt, on one subject, as indeed I generally do on most subjects, but particularly about Northanger Abbey and Persuasion. The behaviour of the general in Northanger Abbey, packing off the young lady without a servant or the common civilities which any bear of man, not to say gentleman, would have shown, is quite outrageously out of drawing and out of nature. Persuasion, accepting the tangled, useless histories of the family in the first 50 pages, appears to me, especially in all that relates to poor Anne and her lover, to be exceedingly interesting and natural. The love and the lover admirably well drawn. Don't you see Captain Wentworth, or don't you in her place, feel him taking the boisterous child off her back as she kneels by the sick boy on the sofa? And is not the first meeting after their long separation admirably well done? And the overhead conversation about the nut? But I must stop. We have got no further than the disaster of Mrs. Musgrave's jumping off the steps. This is really interesting to see another writer analysing Austen. It's so also quite interesting because you've got these two novels that are written at such different times in Austen's life. So Northanger first started when she was a much younger woman. It is slightly different. You have that slightly sense of parodicness with the Gothic novel, whereas Persuasion very much centered in that real life. And you can see the difference in the way she talks about it is very intense. And Edgeworth herself wrote a series of novels. Castle Rackrent in particular is set in Ireland and is talking about absentee landlordism. They are quite sentimental and they are written through the lens of the time, but they are there and she is criticising of it. Austen clearly valued Edgeworth's opinion. When Emma was published in December 1815, Austen asked for a copy of the novel to be sent to Edgeworth, and astonishingly, that copy still survives, and it was sold in 2010 at Sotheby's. You can see it in the centre of these two panels for £79,250, and I believe it went into private hands. We're going to move on from Mariah Edgeworth in a minute, but before we do, I just wanted to highlight these two portraits of Austen and Edgeworth. Now, the one of Edgeworth was painted in 1807 by the painter John Downman, whilst the portrait of Austen comes from much later in the 19th century, much after her death. It's only very loosely based on a sketch made by her sister Cassandra in 1810, in which she is looking much crosser. It's not finished, it's in pencil, and this is a much softened and more saccharine version of it. But when I saw these side by side, I was really struck by that similar use of blue, the similar use of pose even, and the cap. I thought they were so similar. And Edgeworth continued to be a very famous and widely read author throughout the 19th century. This portrait of Austen was commissioned by her nephew, James Edward Austen Lee, when he was writing the memoir. He didn't want to use the picture of Cassandra by Cassandra because it wasn't finished. And so you have this colorized version. And I do wonder if this was influenced, if they're trying to kind of get this sense of the portrait of the lady writer, if this picture of Edgeworth has influenced it. I don't have any answers to that. It's just something I'm thinking, but I just wanted to share them both with you side by side because I thought it was really, really interesting. And yeah, the Austen one is much later. We never visit Georgian Ireland in Austen's novels, but her fourth book, Emma, which was published in 1816, does see a group of characters that we never actually meet, spending time in Ireland. Jane Fairfax, our heroine Emma's bête noire, her enemy that she loves to hate, becomes a frenemy, is orphaned as a child before the opening of the novel and is brought in part up by a friend of her father's, Colonel Campbell. Just before the opening of the novel, Colonel Campbell's daughter, Jane's closest friend, marries a Mr. Dixon, who promptly takes both the new Mrs. Dixon and his new in-laws off to Ireland. We hear all about this from one of Austen's most masterfully drawn characters, Miss Bates, who's just fabulous, and the aunt of Jane Fairfax. Austen has Miss Bates tell us that Jane has heard a great deal of Ireland's beauty from Mr. Dixon. I mean, I do not know that she had ever heard about it from anybody else, but it's very natural, you know, that he should like to speak of his own place while he was paying his addresses. And as Jane used to be very out often walking with them, for Colonel and Mrs. Campbell were very particular about their daughters not walking out often with only Mr. Dixon, for which I do not at all blame them. And of course, she had heard everything he might be telling Miss Campbell about his own home in Ireland. And I think she wrote us word that he had shown them some drawings of the place, views that he had taken himself. He is the most amiable, charming young man, I believe. Jane was quite longing to go to Ireland from his account of things. Neither Jane Fairfax nor her creator Jane Austen managed to visit Ireland themselves, but Jane Austen's brother Henry did. 4 years older than Jane, Henry has a narrative arc of his own that might sound familiar to readers of Pride and Prejudice. Let me see. He changed for the church, then thought about the law before going into the militia. That sounds familiar. Once in the Oxford militia, he quickly and slightly suspiciously, as he didn't meet the necessary property qualifications, rose to become captain lieutenant as well as the paymaster to the regiment. This would set him up well for later years when he set up his own bank, at least for a while. It went bankrupt in the early months of 1816, nearly taking out the fortunes of the entire Austen family with it. But he bounced back. And by December of that same year, by Austen's 41st birthday, he was installed as the curate of Chawton Church. But in 1799, Henry was in Ireland, with his regiment deployed on guard duty at strategic positions on the Royal Port Road between Dublin and Belfast. It is likely that Henry was billeted at least for a time at the Royal Barracks, and this print of the Royal Barracks from Dublin actually comes from Shaw's Corner. It's on the wall of George Bernard Shaw's drawing room. The militia had been sent to Ireland as part of the ongoing repression of the 1798 rebellion, and it is in this repression that we do meet a real version of the Colin Campbell, a real Colonel Campbell active in Ireland. Austen writes of the fictional Colonel Campbell. Colonel Campbell, who had very highly regarded Fairfax as an excellent officer and most deserving young man, and further had indebted to him for such attentions during a severe camp fever as he believed had saved his life. These were claims which he did not learn to overlook, although some years passed away from the death of poor Fairfax before his own return to England put anything in his power, so he is stationed somewhere overseas. When he did return, he sought out the child and took notice of her. He was a married man with only one living child, a girl about Jane's age, and Jane became their guest, paying them long visits and growing favourite with all. Here, in Austen's text, we see a compassionate, generous, and loyal man. Now, is it possible that this fictional Colonel Campbell was inspired by the actual Colonel Colin Campbell, who was born just a year after Austen and in 1798 was a commander of troops stationed in Kildare? Under his command, Captain Thomas Rawson introduced the brutal triangles to which suspected United Irishmen, particularly blacksmiths, carpenters, and publicans, were tied and flogged as a method of torture, with the aim of revealing where the arms for the rebellion were hidden. Now, just a note on this, there is absolutely no mention of this part of Colin Campbell's career on his Wikipedia entry. All that it says of this period is that he saw action in the 1798 Irish Rebellion. That's it. I think it's important to note that there is a distinction between the time in which Austen lived and the time in which, and the world in which she captured on her pages. She was often living in times throughout her life that were deeply tumultuous. It was a time of constant war, of rebellion, of threat. And she's often criticized for not mentioning more expensively these things, war, rebellion, slave trade, or even Ireland more fully in her novels. She seems to have been very clear that she should write what she knew. She'd never been to war or the Caribbean or even to Ireland. And I'm not saying this as a way of diminishing her genius. It seems to be what she chose to write about. And you can see this in the last of her letters that mentions Ireland. This is in 1814, and it's from the same letter in which she talks to Anna about only liking Anna's novels and Miss Edgeworth's. And Anna has sent Jane and her sister, Cassandra, her own novel. She sent the draft, and they've been reading through it and critiquing. I mean, can you imagine anything more terrifying than sending the first draft of your novel to Jane Austen for reading? She must have been a very generous and supportive aunt. I couldn't imagine anything worse than trying to send a first draft of my novel to the author of Pride and Prejudice. Terrifying. And Austen gives back some really good and clever advice. And this is one of them. She says, "We think you had better not leave England. Let the Portmans go to Ireland, but as you know nothing of the manners there, you had better not go with them. You will be in danger of giving false representations. But fascinatingly, actually, Austen was beginning to work on Emma at the time of writing this, about the same time she's working on it. And we can see her taking her own advice in the novel. And she doesn't allow Jane Fairfax to go to Ireland to visit the Campbells. And she definitely does not take her readers with her. Before we close for the evening, I wanted to talk about one last connection with Ireland. And it's a connection that's had a huge influence over Austen's lasting legacy and the ways in which her works have been interpreted and adapted. And that legacy was shaped by an Irish artist, Hugh Thompson. He was born in Coleraine in 1860 and grew up to become one of the most famous illustrators of the late 19th and early 20th century. And he illustrated and created, you can see his name here, what has become it's incredibly influential in some, the first editions that are in from the 1810s are beautiful. They started it off, but this edition is just so gorgeously embellished. And Hugh Thompson has this incredibly light touch in the illustrations that he created. This is, in its own right, a very good copy of this first edition will still reach several £1,000s today. And in part, it's not just because it's shiny. It is very shiny. They're very, very lovely books. But it's also because of these drawings that are within them. Hugh Thompson had started his illustrating career by illustrating Mrs. Gaskell's Cranford, and this was his kind of breakthrough moment and actually led to something called the Cranford School, which was a whole series of book illustrators that were really influenced by this late 18th century kind of period of time, was also known as the Wig and Bonnet Brigade as well. And he also illustrated Shakespeare, Austen, and Dickens. And this was a real change, this book, in the illustrations of Austen. The first illustrations of Pride and Prejudice had been around for 40, 50 years. It wasn't new. And we had a lot of copies that have them as a frontispiece. But this was the first version of the novels to include illustrations throughout, and they fully integrated them into the story. There are 160 illustrations, and it shows all the significant encounters in the storyline. And Thompson had a fabulous ability to capture the spirit of the novel scenes. His drawings are lively, they're really funny, they capture real character, and they've got a really beautiful visual link to the story and the personalities. And it's made this version such a favourite. You can still buy copies today of Pride and Prejudice, of all the novels. He illustrated all of them, not just P&P, but the Peacock editions become particularly famous. And we still sell them today. You will still see this today. It's been such an iconic thing. There's one particular illustration from the Pride and Prejudice that includes a drawing of Darcy and Bingley riding their horses. And for those of you that know, I can't imagine that anyone doesn't, but the BBC adaptation of Pride and Prejudice in 1995 that opens with Darcy and Bingley galloping across, it's so similar to this Hugh Thompson illustration. This is one of the original printer's test proof plates for his illustrations. So it's come out, you can see the way the page is curled, it's come off the printer. And Thompson regularly visited the British Museum and the V&A to research appropriate clothing, room decorations, and furniture design for these illustrations. They're still very much of their age. They are very distinctly Victorian, but they're hugely, hugely influential. And you can still buy copies, well, you can still buy today, not only just copies of the Peacock edition, but you can get it on note bags, bookmarks. There's even a bag version of it, as well as I mentioned, the copies of the novels themselves. As I'm sure you can imagine, I could talk about Jane Austen all day. I could also talk about the limited amount that I know about Irish writing all day. I am currently reading throughout the year James Joyce's Ulysses, and I am absolutely in love with it. So if anybody wants to have a sub-conversation about the links and overlaps between the use of free speech and internalized narrative between Joyce and Austen, I am very much up for that. But I will draw to a close. I have time for some questions. And Austen's works, whether illustrated by Hugh Thompson, whether they've been adapted for stage or screen, or simply animated through our own imaginations, have been with us and by our side now for over 200 years. And this year we celebrate Jane Austen's 250th birthday. It's a time for us to both celebrate and commemorate and look at her work. We can look at it through so many different ways. We look at it through love, through its source of inspiration by our side, And we can also look at it and look at what's behind it and what's beneath it and what's underneath it. And her work might be very much seen as being centered on the English countryside. But tonight, as so often, I hope that I have shown that, as in many different ways and in many parts of the world, in many parts of art, culture, literature, Ireland is always present and was an inspiration for Austen. Thank you so much for listening tonight and for your company.